All right, so in front of you, we are looking at Russia today. We're going to knock this out, get this submitted. And it turns out that if you asked Europeans what they thought about Russia, there was two big thoughts that they had about Russia. One, we'll write down, they thought they were actually backward and oppressive. They were backward and oppressive. In other words, Russia doesn't get a whole lot of respect. They think Europeans think Russians are not on the same level. Europeans think that Russians are not advanced and culture. And there's a couple of reasons for that. In fact, you should probably remember that Russia had not been through a couple of different things that the rest of Europe has been through. Russia has never gone through a scientific revolution. Russia has never gone through an enlightenment. Russia has never gone through an industrial revolution. And a couple of things result from that. In fact, what social class of people benefit the most from enlightenment, scientific revolution, and industrial revolution? What group of people? What class? Okay, middle class does, right? So we have Europeans saw Russians as backward and oppressive. And as Annabelle pointed out just right now, because they never had all those things, they never had that middle class, and that's a big, big deal. In fact, the second line, it says the major problem was that Russia had virtually no middle class. They virtually had no middle class. And that's really important because the middle class, they are not like the lower class are poor, and like what can you do? What practical way can your voice be heard if you are lower class? I mean, there's not a whole lot. If you're upper class, well, you're part of the system, and like you don't want to destroy the system that's taking care of you. The beauty of middle class people is that these people are wealthy enough that their voices and their concerns can be taken seriously, and they can kind of push the government to be more responsive. But Russia literally doesn't have a middle class. And so we're going to see that Russia's not going to have the exact same advantages, and they're not going to have the same successes as the rest of Europe does. It says on the next section, Russia and Europe, it says that Russia was not very urbanized. In fact, it says on the handout by 1700, only 3% of Russians lived in cities. Only 3% of Russians lived in cities. And one of the things that we've actually seen in the last few weeks is that Europe in the 17 and Europe in the 18s has actually gotten really urbanized really quickly. What's responsible for that? What did Europe go through that allowed them to be, pushed them to be urbanized? The Industrial Revolution did, right? Like people flooded from the country to the cities, and cities became overcrowded and cities became polluted. And so Russia, with only 3% of their population living in cities, they're not doing so great compared to the rest of Europe. In fact, of those 3% that live in cities, you could probably identify, because it's like probably the only Russian city you know by name. What's the only Russian city you probably know by name? Moscow. Two-thirds of that 3% lived in Moscow. So Russia is not very urbanized compared to the rest of Europe. And it doesn't really get better over time, even though Russia gets bigger. It says on the handout by 1850, Russia had expanded its land-based empire. In fact, everything on this map, on this screen, is an example of Russia's land-based empire. Russia started off, relatively small. They just have this brown part of the map, but then they get everything that's in color on this map. But even though they get bigger, their cities don't really like catch up. They don't really have cities of size and importance. In fact, it says on the next line that even though we fast forward 150 years, it says the urban population was only 6% of the total population. So it doesn't even grow that much. 6% of the population. It says on the handout that if I was to compare Russia with someone, I wouldn't really compare Russia with France. I wouldn't compare Russia with Great Britain or Germany or Denmark or the Netherlands. In fact, if I was to compare Russia with another country at the time that was in the same ballpark, I would probably compare it kind of like, you'll write down in the blank, the Ottoman Empire. That's a better comparison. And based on what we know, was the Ottoman Empire doing great compared to Western Europe? It was not. In fact, the Ottoman Empire, we know, was in strategic decline. And one of the problems about the Ottoman Empire and this Russian Empire, we'll write down, it was mainly an agricultural economy. It was mainly an agricultural economy. And again, based on what we know, the leading countries in the world are not the ones where the main thing they're doing is farming. Farming is an important part of our economy today, but it's not the only thing. In fact, pretty much all the countries where the only thing you're doing is farming are countries that are not going to do well ultimately. It was an agricultural empire. So they there are some needs in this Russian empire to grow technologically. In fact, if I live here in Moscow, Moscow's over here. If I want to move soldiers or merchants or men to the East Coast, what am I going to need to have a new technology that's going to be able to move people thousands of miles quickly? Trains, right? And now I can't just decide to build a train line. I can't decide I'm going to start from the East Coast and they'll start over here. We'll meet magically in the middle. I need actually engineers to do this job. But the problem is Russia doesn't have any engineers. Like they don't have that educated group of people. So they're going to have to bring them from the outside. And one of the countries that they're going to go to and ask for engineers to come over to Russia, help them with these jobs, is the country where the Industrial Revolution began. Where did the Industrial Revolution begin? Not the Americas. Where? Great Britain did, exactly. So we're going to write down that British and American engineers on the next line. British and American engineers were brought in to help with rail and textile mills, this railroad projects. They didn't have the engineers to do it, so they were looking to them to help with rail and textile mills, other factories that they needed engineers to be a part of the process. But apart from some of this very limited usage of outsiders and their knowledge to come in, it says on your handout that the Russian government was not interested in industry. And there's a question why. Why wouldn't you want industry? Why wouldn't you want growth and jobs and business? Like, why wouldn't Russia want to be like the rest of Europe? And there's a really important reason why they didn't want that. It says on the next line, industrialization requires, you'll write down, an educated class of entrepreneurs. It requires an educated class of entrepreneurs. What I mean by this is that it's typically those middle class people that are the factory owners. It's the people that are willing to be businessmen. But there's something really dangerous about having educated people, because it says on the next line, it says education leads to what skill? Literacy. And that's super dangerous. You might remember that there was one group of people in the United States that you could not teach to read. It was a crime to teach them to read. Slaves. Frederick Douglass, you might remember him as one of the most famous formerly enslaved man. He ran away. He became an author. He became an abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass tells the story that his old master told him that whenever a slave learns to read, you've ruined them forever. You've lost them forever as a slave. Because slaves were no longer satisfied. Once they could read, they could be educated. For Frederick Douglass, and for pretty much thousands of other people, what do you think the first book an enslaved African would learn to read would be? The Bible. And the Bible is a super awkward book for slavery. You get to chapter 3, it says that every human being came from two parents. Who were they? Adam and Eve. It just doesn't say there was like, okay, Adam and Eve were for the white people and these other two for the... If all humans are from Adam and Eve, how could you justify enslaving one group of humans if all of us come from the exact same parents? Plus, when you go further in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, the hero of heroes is Moses, and Moses is most famous for, you know what? Freeing a bunch of slaves from Egypt and giving them their freedom. In the New Testament, Jesus says awkward things like love your neighbor as yourself. How can you love your neighbor if you're whipping, enslaving, and selling them as property? So literacy is really dangerous. Not just the Bible, but what if you read John Locke? What if you read Rousseau? What if you read Thomas Jefferson or the Declaration of the Rights of Man? So they don't want that. It says literacy leads to ideas, that leads to classical liberalism, socialism, possibly revolution, possibly. To the right of that last arrow, you're going to write down, it threatens government power. Educated people threaten government power. The worst thing in the world is for people to be educated, because then they're not satisfied anymore. We don't want a middle class. A middle class is educated enough and they are wealthy enough to start asking for changes I don't feel comfortable giving. After revolution, make sure you write down it threatens government power. We also see that not only does Russia not have a middle class, there's also two other things that makes Russia different than the rest of Europe. One area of difference, it says on your handout, Russia was different from Western Europe in, you'll write down the word religion. And by way of review, I don't want the answer Christianity. That's too broad. There was two religions that pretty much everyone in Western Europe was. In Spain, in Portugal, in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France. Everyone was one of these two specific religions. Don't say Christianity. What are they? Catholic or? No. Yeah, remember there's that Martin Luther guy? If you and I were in Western Europe, pretty much everyone was Protestant, or everyone was Catholic. One of those two. Those are the only two choices. But not in Russia. What's the main one in Russia? What's the main one in Russia? What's the main religion in Russia? Eastern Orthodox. So on our handout where we have written down that the main difference was religion, make sure that you have Eastern Orthodox as the example. So that's also different. You know, like when people look at the Russians, there's another difference there. Now, there's a second difference. And the second difference has to do with, you'll write down the alphabet. And that's like a really weird example, because what alphabet do we use, and Spanish uses, and German uses? The Latin alphabet, but the Russians, they don't use the Latin alphabet. This is what the Russians use. And I want you to write down the name of it, the Cyrillic Alphabet. This is the alphabet that Russians use. And if you look at that alphabet, there's not a lot of similarities, right? I mean, some of them are, like maybe the letter A is the same, looks like the letter M is the same, and maybe it looks like T is the same. But I think a lot of it, if you take, the letter K is the same, but the rest of it is radically different. And so people are looking at the Russians and like, yeah, you guys don't have a middle class. You didn't have an industrial revolution. You didn't have a scientific revolution. You didn't have an enlightenment. You don't have the same type of Christianity. You literally don't even have the same alphabet we do. You can kind of see why Russia is left out of the group chat of Western civilization. They still use that to this day. And Russia is still left out of the group chat. So on the handout, below that, Russia and Asia. So Russia does want to expand. And it says on the handout that Russia expanded to the east toward the Pacific Ocean and to the south. So there's two areas that they're expanding. One area that they're expanding to the east, of course. The Pacific Ocean is important because, like, what's the problem with water with Russia that we mentioned again and again and again? Yeah, they have all this Arctic Ocean. Oh, that's great, but who's going to go spring break on the beach up here? Literally nobody. But the east, we have some warm water, so they do want to go to the Pacific, but they also want all these areas here too, because these people are mainly Muslim. These people are non-white people, and so you can kind of use those differences to kind of like justify why we can beat those people up and conquer them. The South and the South. Russia's army, though backwards compared with Western Europe, was able to, you'll write down, easily defeat. They were able to easily defeat the non-industrialized Central Asian nomads. The non-industrialized Central Asian nomads. Here's a picture of the people that they fought in taking over their empire. What kind of weapons do these guys have? Bow and arrow. Yeah, I'm sure they're like really good at that, but not as good as a gun. And what kind of protection do they have? What kind of armor is that made out of? It looks like it's actually made out of wood. And I'm sure they did their best. I'm sure all that, but is that going to do anything against a Russian bullet? No. And so Russia's not the best army in the world, but compared to the people in the area, they're amazing. You know, they're amazing. So what now? I don't know what that means, but Russia doing great based on the neighborhood. Now they do also expand to some important cities like Vladivostok, and I'm going to show it to you on the map. Here's Vladivostok here. You can see it's on the Pacific, but it's also, if you take note, I mean, here's Moscow. Man, Moscow is way far away. What is kind of important about the neighborhood Vladivostok's in? What is it next to that has been of interest to Europeans lately? Yeah, but more specifically, China and Japan. We talked about this desire to get into China and Japan, and Vladivostok is there. It says on the handout it was Russia's most southern city. And it is. And it's also, you know, if you look at it, it's also super close to China and Japan. So that's important. And Russia didn't just beat up Muslim countries, they did for sure. They also took over these two countries here, this one in green and this one in purple. This one in green, we'll write down on the handout, Russia took over Christian countries. This country in green is called Georgia, and they had no problem taking over Georgia. They also had another country right next to Georgia, and this is where a famous family is from. The Kardashians are from this family. Yeah, this is Armenia. If you don't know how to spell that, it's Armenia. They are Armenian. And so that's right here by Iran in the Middle East. That's where the Kardashian family are. And that's probably the only Orthodox celebrities you know, because probably none of you know any Orthodox people. I have some Orthodox friends, but even though you don't hear about them a lot, there are actually 250 million Orthodox in the world, 250,000,000. It's the second largest church on planet Earth, Catholic Church, then Orthodox Church. But most of them are like Russian or Greek or Armenian, and you probably don't have a whole lot of Armenian friends, so you probably don't have a lot. So there's three branches of Christianity: Catholic, Protestant, and Armenian. So those are the three big branches. Most, like 95% of Russians are Armenian, are Orthodox. 95% of Greeks are people in I think Bulgaria and Ukraine. So pretty much anywhere east of here are Orthodox. Most white people in the United States aren't from Eastern Europe, though. Most white people in America today are from like England or France or Portugal or Spain, and that's why we are only really familiar with Catholic or Protestant. It says on the handout there was one Muslim country. We'll write down the last blank. We have a Muslim majority, Azerbaijan. Finally, Great Britain, you'll write down Britain feared Russian expansion. In fact, Britain feared that Russian expansion would mess with their desires in India. So Britain feared that it would interfere with India. And last two, and then we're going to finish this up and turn it in. Russia had long-term contact with the West as far back as the 1600s. There's one leader, the most important Russian leader you should know. He's the guy that believed we should modernize Russia, that we should try to like become more Western. He's the guy who realized the importance of a navy. His name you'll write down was Peter the Great. He's like one of the few guys you should really know by name. He wanted to modernize and Westernized Russia. His name was Peter the Great. And finally, last thing, one of the last things that they did was, you'll write down, emancipating the serfs. That word emancipate means to free. It is EMANCIPATING. Emancipating the serfs. Unlike the rest of Europe got rid of their serfs like in the year 1300. They had serfs 500 years later. This is one of the reasons why they are definitely behind the time. With that, we should be done. I'm going to collect those. You should get 100. It should be awesome.